Hi, this is part 3 of the How to Create Your First Online Application. In this video, I want to look at how to take what we've learned so far and wrap that up into a library that we can use in multiple projects. What we've done so far is leverage the context initializer and a context resolver, as well as a context container to establish and maintain our session information when the Esso session authenticate method executes. What I want to do right now is get rid of these inside this web application and abstract those into a library. Thankfully, you don't have to do this from scratch. We've been working with this in our example code all along. So if we go ahead and skip over to the community website, community.superoffice.com, and we click on the developer link at the top, you'll see the mega menu appear. And underneath the online section, I'm going to scroll down to downloads. On the downloads page, there's this SuperOffice.DevNet.Online examples using NuGet download link. Go ahead and download that and bring that down to your computer. And now I have it here inside Visual Studio. If I look at the solution, it contains 4 solution folders, each pertaining to a particular type of application. Here I have my system user app examples, I have some utility libraries, I have some web form examples, and I even have a WinForm example. What I'm interested in this video is to take a look at the SuperOffice.DevNet.Online.Login library. So let's go ahead and take a look at that right now. I'm going to expand on this a little bit. You can see inside the helpers, there's this SuperOffice authentication helper, and that's the core of this library, truly. This is where you're going to do your authorization and also attempt to log in. I also want to take a look at the Esso plugins library. This should seem familiar to you because this is where the context initializer is, the context resolver, and the HTTP context provider. So I want to go ahead and use this SuperOffice.DevNet.Online.Login library inside my Acme Colors application. So I'm going to go ahead and right click, open folder and Explorer, and I see this folder. I want to go ahead and just copy this, and I want to move this over into my application directory. So here I am inside my Acme Colors projects, right? This is Visual Studio Projects, Acme Colors. So I'm going to go ahead and go in there, and I'm going to paste that project in there. It's going to go ahead and copy it all in, and that's fine. So here's the CS proj file, and that's what I'm interested in. So I'm going to go ahead back into my Acme Colors application. Here I'm going to delete everything underneath app data because I don't want those in there anymore. I want to keep those separate in a library. So I'm going to right click on the solution and choose Add Existing Project. Open up my Acme Colors folder. Open up the SuperOffice DevNet Online Login library and just go ahead and add that. And now we can see that we've added that to the project. It has some information here about updating or missing some NuGet packages. So I'm going to go ahead and just click to restore those from online packages. If we rebuild it, that should work out just fine. And I want to make sure that the projects that I'm using inside Acme Colors are the same version. So I'll open up the package config, and I'll see that the NetServer core is 5893.10.15, and Acme Colors is 5893.10.15, the same version. So that's good. These package versions should match. Okay, while we're in here, let's go ahead and add a reference to our new project. So I'll choose project references. This should be the only one that's shown. I'll click OK. Should be towards the top. SuperOffice.DevNet.Online.Login. There we go. So this is an open source library that's not yet up on NuGet, but it will be up on NuGet shortly. Maybe even by the time you're watching this. Okay, now that I've made a reference to that, I shouldn't have to make any changes to my callback controller. So I'll go ahead and take a look inside there. All that validate token, nothing here has changed. We're still using the core for this. But for the authentication stuff, now I can go ahead and make this a little bit cleaner. Retype this and simply say if SuperOffice.DevNet SuperOffice.Online.Login dot SuperOffice auth helper dot try login. And here it's expecting a callback model, and it's going to give me out a reason. There are a couple of overloads. I can pass in a SuperOffice context or a token. So in this case, I'm going to pass in the SAML token and specify the token type. Before we do that, let's go ahead and just change this SAML token type to actually use the built-in functionality here. Say toString. Let's go ahead and run this. So the main web page appears. I'll click Login. Here I'll set a breakpoint on the reason. So let's go ahead and just step over this. And then let's go ahead and step into the try login method and see what's going on underneath the covers. So step into it. Here we can see setting the reason. It's creating a token handler just like we're used to. Here it's looking to see if there's an app setting for certificates in app folder. That should be false. So we're not going to go ahead and try and set the certificate to an explicit certificate in the app folder. We'll go ahead and just use the default like we've been using in the previous examples. Here it's going to validate the token. In fact, it successfully validates. And now we're going to build up this type called SuperOffice context. This is a data model that's built into our DevNet.Online.Login library. And this just contains the usual information that you expect for the currently logged on user. Username, name, ticket, net server URL, those sort of things. And it's going to extract that information from the claims. We'll come back to that later. Now it's going to go into an overload method for try login. We're going to set the context. We're going to establish forms authentication here. This kind of helps out a little bit for security down the road. If SuperOffice is already authenticated, it's going to go ahead and log out, but it's not. So now we're going to go ahead and try and authenticate. You can see now we're using the session authenticate method, but we're populating a Esso credentials data type and setting the ticket to the context ticket. And this is instead of using the username and passing the ticket in the username. And that's okay. So we'll go ahead, step over that. It appears as though authentication was successful. So that's great. We're going to go ahead, continue on, get out the principal. Here's something interesting because we want to establish the context identifier for the current principal. If we take a look at this now and we look at the database context identifier, it's set to the customer, but we want to make sure that that's set correctly. This is useful when you want to set the context or the context identifier if this was to happen for an on-premise customer. So let's go ahead, we'll step over that. And then we're going to instantiate a new contact agent. So let's do that. We're going to get our contact actually. So now we can see we've got our company information. And we're going to go ahead and populate that into this context type. And authentication was successful, so it returns true. There we go. And then we can also check the current principal, so it pulls that out from memory. And we can go in and inspect that, and you can see it's Esso remote WCF identity type. But it is, in fact, an Esso principal. So there we go. That's using the library, the SuperOffice.DevNet.Online.Login library to authenticate. Quite simple. Just replace all that code with the try login method, and it works. Okay, let's step back and take a look at this in a more visual sort of sense, rather than looking at the code. During the try login method, we get the token that was passed to us from the callback. We take that token and we need to validate that security token. And we're using the SuperOffice.CRM.Online.Core package in order to do that. Next, it's going to create a forms authentication ticket. So that it establishes a session for these requests. If you don't do this, then the next time you try and submit a request, the SuperOffice session is no longer going to be available, and therefore you're going to get some sort of error message that tells you that there's no SuperOffice session, therefore you can't make the calls to the web services. So you have to establish a session somehow. The way that we're doing it in these examples is using forms authentication. So it creates a cookie and holds the authentication ticket. Next, we have to establish the Esso session so that subsequent calls to the SuperOffice services will know where to get that session from, and it's going to be stored inside the partner HTTP context, which is really just a container that knows how to set the Esso session into a session state and knows how to get it out of session state when you're making calls to the web services. The context initializer and the context resolver, these classes are responsible for establishing where the web service calls are going to go to. So you don't have to set the net server URL in a configuration file. Now that we're dealing with things in a more online type environment, the context initializer and the context resolver is going to be able to handle all that for you. So that's basically the 3 steps that we're doing here and the 2 different libraries that are necessary to make that happen. Going back looking at the code now, it should be a little bit more familiar. We get that token in, we're going to create a super ID token handler which knows how to validate the token. If we come down here, it's looking if there's a this is a Boolean configuration setting that says, hey, we've actually installed a certificate in the app data folder. Use that instead of using the one that we installed in the machine. In this case, I've installed the certificates on the machine and I do not have their certificates in the app data folder, so it's going to skip all of this logic and go straight to the else. It's going to set the certificate validator to pure trust, which means it's going to look in my local computer's certificate store for those 3 certificates to validate this claim. Next, I'm going to use the token handler validate token method and pass the token in, also pass in the token type, and that will give me back my super ID token, which contains all the claims. So you can see here I'm establishing a SuperOffice context data type, which is a model that we've created. It's nothing SuperOffice specific. Actually, that class is right down here in the login. So that's down here inside the SuperOffice.DevNet.Online.Login models directory. And this contains properties. The SuperOffice context contains properties that you would expect relevant to this tenant or this customer. And then it calls this other try login method and passes in this context. And this is where it's going to try and establish the session using cookies. So I'll just skip down. It's not this one, it's the next one. Pass it in the context, and then we're going to put out an error if there is any error. So here we're just copying the context. Here we're going to establish forms authentication. Here we're going to establish the session. And then as long as it's authentic, if it's not authenticated, then we're going to go ahead and close the session and log out. That way you'll be redirected to log in if that ever needs to happen. And down here, this is where we establish the session. So when we authenticate, it's going to call off to the web services and authenticate this user. And what happens is it needs to establish the context for this user. So it's going to use those SuperOffice plugins. The context initializer is going to get called first. It passes in the context identifier, which is the tenant ID, and then it takes out the net server URL and sets the web services.remote base URL. Established in a session will establish the context and then store the session, or at least the principal, inside the HTTP context provider so that it knows where to get it whenever we're going to make web service calls. And then when it grabs that session, it's going to go ahead and set that inside the Esso credentials ticket in the web service SOAP header every time it makes that request to SuperOffice. Okay, so coming back, once the session is authenticated successfully, we're just going to go ahead and get that principal there and then call the web service for get contact for that principal's contact ID. And using that, we're going to set the additional properties that are inside this SuperOffice context class that we created. We're going to just get our full name and then the associate name and also the associate ID. You'll notice here when we're calling the contact agent get contact, what's actually happened behind the scenes is it's creating a SOAP request to the NetServer Web Services. Now, in that SOAP header, it contains an Esso credentials type, which contains a ticket. Where does it get that ticket from? That's where this session here comes into play. When it calls get contact, it's going to create that SOAP envelope, and in that SOAP header, it's going to call into the context resolver, get out, make sure that there is a context, and then it's going to pull out the ticket from the principal that's stored in the HTTP context provider. It gets that user's ticket, sets it in the SOAP header, and then completes this request. As long as that successfully authenticates on the other end, we'll get that contact back, and then we're able to set these properties. And then we'll return true. So try login is true. And then I've added additional code here. And this allows me to store the information that we just got from this context for setting the SuperOffice context, all that information. We want to be able to store that somewhere. So in this case, I've created a customer data source. And all this source is going to serialize and deserialize the customer information into an XML file. Let's go ahead and inspect the data source. Let's go to the definition of this guy. You'll see it's set up as a singleton. When it's initialized, it's going to go ahead and deserialize that from a file. It's going to read it from this data source, which I store inside the C temp directory in a file called customers.xml. Then to deserialize it, it's going to look, see if it exists. If it does, it's going to create an XML serializer, read this into a text reader, and repopulate the customer's property, which is a list of SuperOffice context data types. If we go ahead and look at that, you'll see it just contains information about that user. Interesting thing that we haven't discussed really is that it will contain a customer key, determine whether or not this is an on-site or an online customer, and if there's a web client URL. And these three right here are only used if this customer is a on-site customer, not an online customer. So it's kind of interesting to see how this could be used in both an online application and simultaneously used for an on-premise or on-site customer. So this information you would normally want to store inside a database. This allows you to contain your information in a multi-tenant type way, right? You want to be able to distinguish your users, and so ideally you want to store that user information in your own user tables separate from the SuperOffice database. All right, so coming back, looking at the callback controller, once the data source is set, then we're going to go ahead and just return the view. So let's go ahead and run this application again. We'll look at the changes that I've made, and you can see how all of that works. So I've got the login button up here. You can see down in the status, I've got this calling the callback and the login method. I'll go ahead and click login. Since I've already logged in before, it recognizes that, and it's just going to redirect me back to the callback controller. Now you can see this time I didn't set a breakpoint inside the index or the try login method because we've already gone past that point. So the SAML token was received, try login was successful, it's established my customer inside my customer database, which again is just an XML file, and then return the default view for the callback controller, which is this one right here. I've got a callback page now, and I've got two links on it. Let's go ahead and check out that view. So down in my views folder, I've got a callback folder and an index. So here on the index file, it's simply creating a unordered list. First list item is get company info, which is going to call the get my contact method in the callback controller. I've also got another link established here called navigate to protected view, and it's going to call the index method in the protected controller. And I'll get to that in a second. Before I do, let's go back to the contact controller and take a look at this get my contact method. In the get contact method, it's going to use this SuperOffice auth helper authorize method. What this does is going to make sure that we actually have a established session. Let's go to the definition. Shall redirect is a method that basically checks to see if we're authorized or not. You can see it right down here below. If we're not authorized, then it's going to set a redirect back to SuperOffice login for this user. This is going to redirect us if we're not authorized automatically. We're not going to have to do any additional work. That's the whole point. Then we're going to go ahead and use the contact agent to get my contact out, which is the currently logged on user, and then it's going to return that and pass that into the view. So if we come back to the page and I say get company information, you can see we step into that method, get my contact, authorize was totally fine, good to go. We're going to get my contact, make that call. We'll see we get a valid contact back, and then I'll just go ahead and hit continue to see the view. And all I've done is get my name and the country for that user and show them a couple labels and a couple text boxes, and that's it. Now you can see up in the navigation pane for this application, we've got a couple new tabs here. One is called the callback page, so that I can go back to where I came from when I was getting that information. I'll hit continue. Now there's this protected page. And before I go there, I want to switch back to the slides for a moment and explain a little bit about what's going on. We've got these two helpers in the login library. There's the SuperOffice authorize attribute. This is similar to the basic .NET authorize attribute. And then we've got this isAuthorize method, and that's what you just saw when I was calling get my contact. If we look back at that code, you can see it calls SuperOffice auth helper.authorize. For both of these, we were checking the cookie and we were checking the session. We also verified that the user's context was what we expected, and we checked if it was authorized with NetServer. And both of these types are doing just that. They're checking these values, and if for any reason any of these fail, it will go ahead and redirect the user back to the SuperOffice login page and initiate the redirect so that the user can try logging in again. Looking back at the code, now I want to show you the protected controller. So here I've just got a generic controller, doesn't really have anything in it except an index method. And here on the class decorator, I've got the SuperOffice authorize attribute. Like I said before, this is very similar to the basic .NET authorize attribute where it makes sure that the current user is logged in. If he's not, then this controller will not be allowed to run. And the SuperOffice authorize attribute will actually redirect the user back to the login page again. So if we go in here, we'll see that it's using the SuperOffice auth helper.isAuthorize method. And if the current user is not authorized, then again, it will redirect back to SuperOffice so that he must log in and go back through the controller, the callback controller, to get back to here to where he can see the protected page. So looking at the website now, if I go ahead and click on the protected link, you'll see I drop down into the authorize attribute. I've got a breakpoint set up here, and if I just go past that, I am authenticated, therefore it allows me to continue. I got a breakpoint set up inside the protected controller and the index method, and it just goes ahead and returns the default view. It simply says protected. You're viewing a page protected by an attribute. Now this page is defined inside the views folder, inside the protected folder, and here's the index that I've defined. So thanks again for watching. Hopefully you've learned a little bit how this SuperOffice.DevNet.Online.Login library can help simplify your online and on-site web applications. I haven't covered how to do it with on-site yet, but pretty much it's going to be similar to how you would set up a web panel for your application and passing in the correct information using template variables. Database serial number, associate ID, uh, customer identifier, things like that. And looking through the online.login library, you'll discover what's necessary and checked. Hopefully, it also teaches some of the concepts necessary for basic web application development, such as forms authentication, session state handling, using the SuperOffice online library for security token validation, and also validating and verifying the current user with a valid SuperOffice principal. If you want to contribute, you should be able to find this library up very soon at github.com/superoffice/devnet. So thanks a lot for watching. Have a great day.